Welcome to the Legendarium. Today we'll be talking about the knights during the High Middle Ages. By the year 1000, the world was changing. Kingdoms were becoming bigger, and lords were ruling over sophisticated courts rather than just mead halls full of hairy, foul-smelling men. Castles were looking less like this and more like this. We'll be covering the Battle of Hastings, chivalry and heraldry, armor and tournaments, crusades and Arthurian legend, castles, and legends about castles. It's going to be a busy day. When the year 1066 began, knights were firmly established as the warrior aristocracy of Christian Europe. That year, Duke William of Normandy invaded England with an army that included armored mounted knights along with archers and infantry. While some of King Harold of England's men rode horses into battle, they dismounted to fight, while wearing chainmail tunics and swinging battle axes big enough to chop off the head of a horse. King Harold also had the high ground during the battle, which should have given him a leg up. However, the Normans had a secret weapon, the heavy cavalry charge. Knights would steady themselves on their stirrups, balance in their saddles, and charge headlong towards the enemy, putting 1,000 pounds of force at the tip of a couched lance. And rather than just charge once, they would charge, skewer a few men, wheel around, and then charge again. And doing that all day gradually wore down the English line until King Harold's line collapsed, King Harold's skull collapsed, and Duke William the Bastard was able to promote himself to King William the Conqueror. And even if the Battle of Hastings didn't confirm once and for all the supremacy of the mounted knight, it suited knights everywhere to believe that 1066 put them firmly in the saddle. However, here's a question for you. How do you govern a class of men whose profession is literally slaughtering people? Well, the answer that society came up with was chivalry. The church was an especially big fan of chivalry, especially since during the early Middle Ages, from about 500 to 1000, the knights were really fond of plundering church lands. Now, chivalry was based around devotion to the church, loyalty to one's lord, and fidelity to women. Chivalry also applied to other knights. If you defeated another knight in battle, you were expected to treat him honorably instead of just killing him like a dog or a peasant. Now, you have to keep in mind, though, that chivalry only applied to other knights. Obviously, if a knight defeated a peasant, the peasant could expect to be slaughtered immediately and then have his boots and clothes stolen to sell to a merchant. Chivalry also meant what you wanted it to mean. The writer Chrétien de Troyes wrote that a noble knight would never think of wronging a woman. In fact, he would rather cut off his own arm than harm a woman in any way. However, if he saw a woman accompanied by another knight, did battle with the knight and won, then he could do what he pleased with the woman. So chivalry was just full of these little convenient rules. Now, knights wanted to be recognized for all of their killings and abductions, so they invented something called heraldry. In the days before photo ID, this was the only way to tell who somebody was. At first, around 1100, heraldry might be something as simple as painting wooden shields in a particular design, in part to hide the grain of the wood so an enemy could not cut along the grain and split open the shield. In time, heraldry grew into an elaborate system of identification, including cats, lions, griffins, and dragons. Some of them could even resemble abstract art, like a pair of arms clutching a golden coin. Knights rode into battle with heraldry on their armor, with trees stuck on their helmet, and lions painted on their shields. Of course, they weren't doing this to be fashionable. They did it to advertise the fact that they were rich and worth taking alive instead of being killed like a common peasant. One knight even had, "Whoever captures Sir Robert Norris will get 100,000 gold coins" engraved on his helmet to make sure that no one would kill a big prize like him. They even had a court of chivalry, and it wasn't to decide whose turn it was to kill the dragon this week or who would face the Black Knight in tournament, but to decide who had the rights to which prisoner. It also decided cases where people were arguing over a certain coat of arms for their families, and the cases over heraldic seals could go on for years. But knights didn't just have chivalry and codes of conduct to set them apart, they also had armor. With it, knights could hope to survive battle and win great renown. The simple chainmail tunics and helmets with nose visors worn at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 gave way to chainmail suits that covered the whole body by the 1200s. New helmets that covered the entire head came into fashion by the 1300s. However, during that century, something else came into style, the bodkin arrow, and its needle-like shape was capable of punching through chainmail. So knights began sewing plates of armor into the mail to protect their arms, chest, legs, feet, and any other vulnerable bits. Bear in mind, only rich knights could afford to have their armor redesigned like this, while poor knights still had to wear great-grandpa's chainmail tunic into battle. Pretty soon, knights also invented helmets with visors, but it would not be until the 1400s that knights went into battle wearing plate armor from head to toe. And just as armor affected the tournaments, tournaments affected armor. In the 11th and 12th centuries, tournaments were fought across miles of countryside in a bloody free-for-all. It provided a chance to learn war by fighting war in a huge free-for-all, with groups of knights fighting each other or sometimes ganging up on loners. So much for chivalry. And losers could lose their horses and armor or even their lives if they failed to pay a ransom. Well, the lords got a little tired of the best knights getting killed off. After all, who's going to terrorize the peasants and chase off rivals? The church also objected to the free-for-alls enough that they even threatened denial of last rites to anyone killed in a tournament. So instead of trying to ban the tournaments outright, which was pointless because they were too popular with the knights, the kings came up with another idea: tax the tournaments. They came up with license fees that knights had to pay to enter. They also redesigned tournaments around single events governed by strict rules, much like modern sports. And much like modern sports, safety equipment came into vogue. By the 1200s, three-pronged lances came into style, as they would splinter rather than go through armor. Specialist armor for the tournaments was also invented, like devices to hold the lance to the breastplate. In Germany, smiths created spring-loaded armor that burst in the face of enemies when struck with a lance. Tournament saddles allowed knights to slip off, whereas battle saddles would keep knights lashed to the horse. Tilt barriers made sure that knights didn't run into each other. In short, the tournament became a spectator sport rather than combat. And this is how we get our modern image of the tournament, with two knights jousting each other from across a tilt barrier with splintering lances and absolutely nobody getting killed, at least not on purpose. However, new rules and regulations alone don't make the world less violent. Indeed, with all of these knights running around, it's not surprising that the world could become a violent place, but Pope Urban had a way to make the world more peaceful, or at least Christian Europe more peaceful. In 1095, Pope Urban called upon the Christians to free the Holy Land from the Turks who had recently forbidden Christians the right of pilgrimage to the places where Christ held his ministry and was crucified. Now, Pope Urban didn't just want to restore pilgrims' rights to the holy shrines. He also wanted to get the warring knights out of Europe and perhaps give the church and Christians some peace. So this started the first of 7 major crusades and many lesser ones, as thousands of knights trudged across land or sailed across the sea to fight in the Holy Land. They went along with kings and commoners who went to cleanse their souls by killing their fellow men. It attracted pious knights who wanted to die for Christ, second sons who wanted to carve out a fiefdom, and the footloose longing for adventure. Now, the quest for the Holy Land helped to inform Arthurian legend during the High Middle Ages. Of course, many lords were away for years at a time, leaving their wives in charge of the castle. This meant people got used to seeing women dispense justice and manage estates. It also meant that men feared some rogue, like Lancelot, might steal their wives' hearts and their bed. While the minstrels of yesteryear celebrated how far Siegfried and Roland could knock an enemy's head from his shoulders, chivalric romances celebrated the idea of courtly love, in which a man and woman loved each other but strictly in a non-romantic way, with a man winning jousts for his lady instead of climbing into her bed. This was the idea that informed the tragic love triangle of King Arthur, Queen Guinevere, and Sir Lancelot. A pity that Lancelot and Guinevere didn't keep their love courtly. Second, the Grail quest began appearing in literature. It was a metaphor for the Crusades. Just as the Knights of King Arthur's Round Table left the comforts of home and family to search exotic lands for the Holy Grail, the Crusaders were leaving home and family in real life to try and win the Holy Land back for Christendom. And like the Crusades, the Grail quest often ended with no man proving pure enough to keep the cup that touched Christ's lips. And just as the Grail Knights ultimately failed in their quest, so did the Crusaders ultimately fail, despite 200 years of fighting in faraway lands to try and preserve holy places, just as Arthur's knights tried to preserve holy relics. But at least they had the castle to go home to. And it was a better castle. Wooden motte and Bailey castles gave way to the new stone castles, which didn't burn down nearly as easily, which is a big plus in warfare. Knights' main job was to protect the lord and his castle. Fighting for a lord meant a grant of land, possibly a good marriage, and the most successful of all got castles of their own. Throughout England, there were 1,500 castles and another 10,000 in the Holy Roman Empire. Now you have to keep in mind, castles were not built for comfort but for defense. Windows were little more than arrow slits, which made the main halls dark, damp, and filled with body heat and odors from everyone living and sleeping together in the great central hall. Toilets, called garderobes, consisted of a stone room that stuck out from the main wall with a hole underneath where urine and feces would fall down into the moat, which meant that moats, instead of being filled with water and crocodiles, were filled with what had come out of people's bowels. I'm sure that made the castle smell delicious. However, despite the smell, medieval people actually hung their clothes in the garderobe in the belief that the horrible smell would at least keep the insects from crawling in their clothes and laying eggs. Now, while we might think of castles today as symbols of war, to medieval people they meant peace. Since castles were so strong and so well fortified, you could go 50 or 60 years before anybody grows bold enough to try to lay siege to a castle. However, when that once-in-a-60 year comes, it could be a brutal affair. A besieging army would hurl the severed heads of defenders over the walls with catapults, along with the corpses of rotting animals to spread disease. In another example of an arms race in the Middle Ages, defenders built bigger and stronger walls, with crusaders bringing back ideas from Southwest Asia like rounded towers. Meanwhile, the attackers designed ever better pieces of siege equipment, going from catapults to trebuchets. The castle defenders still had one more trick, though. If you've ever seen those clockwise spiral staircases, those were actually designed to force swordsmen to fight with their left hand, thus putting them at a disadvantage. And those little slits you see in the towers everywhere were meant to fire arrows from. The importance of castles in the Middle Ages is shown by the many medieval legends that sprang up around them. Yester Castle in East Lothian, Scotland, was built in the 1200s by Sir Hugo de Giffard, a man said to be obsessed with the pseudoscientific field of alchemy. According to legend, he built the castle with the help of the devil, who provided him with an army of goblins to help build his house. In particular, he focused his attention on Goblin Hall, where he performed mysterious arcane rituals. Long after his death, locals walled up the entrance to the underground Goblin Hall, where men say they can still hear the wails of his blood sacrifices. Mukachevko Castle, in what is today Ukraine, was built by Prince Fyodor Koryadovich, who ordered his men to dig a well to prepare for sieges. But when they failed to find any water, the prince offered a bag of gold to anyone who could find water, despite the fact that he had barely a scrap of silver to his name. And unfortunately, the devil took him up on his offer. He jumped into a hole and immediately water splashed up. Aware that he didn't have the promised bag of gold, Prince Fedor scrapped together a few pieces of gold and put them into a tiny bag, noting that he never specified how big the bag had to be. Cheated, the devil leaped into the well and made such terrible noises that no one ever wanted to serve in the castle, and it had to be abandoned. Perhaps he was making the sound of modern pop music. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. Hopefully I'll be getting the final episode of The Knights up a little later this weekend.